Hi, this is a question for Francesca and Jeffrey, because I'm trying to think where to place the question, because you presented to us case studies based on different artists from the same generation that may have brought you to a similar set of questions, but you were working out of an institution. And I think this was brought up, yes, this was brought up earlier today. The issue of legacy and conservation, while intrinsic to museums, because they're taking care of a legacy as part of their mission, may not apply in the same way to foundations and estates. And it seems that you were sitting halfway into the territory of estates and artist legacies, while at the same time firmly in the museum context. Not to say that the funding for the project also comes into play in setting goals and expectations and reaching certain benchmarks. So with that said, could you just speak to that complexity from, I'm interested in your personal experience and navigating the competing interests while at the same trying to find the best possible resolutions to these questions that you were faced with.
It's a great question, and it was something I think we had to navigate throughout the project. In the first two slides, we attempted to show the 9 or so somewhat monolithic case studies that we undertook as we went through the last, say, 7 or so years of research, and it was essentially us, as you point out, wearing 2 or more hats. In that the study was devised in some respects for the institution at the end to resolve some of the practical issues that the Panza collection possessed, given the kind of controversies that the museum inherited via the acquisition of those works. But at the same time, we also wanted to pursue the investigation of the questions around the way those artists were working, around the condition of those particular objects, in a much broader way, beyond the practical questions. So,
yeah, I mean, is this on? Yes. So it was complicated. It remains complicated. We don't. In fact, there's sort of, in a way, I would say, some unsettled business. The relationship between states and museums, as you're saying, can be a tricky one. The sets of we're talking about often 2 different sets of imperatives that kind of intersect, but they are 2 sets. And I would add that there's a market aspect to this sort of a framework, a market framework for this situation too. When you include the participation of, say, a gallery that is representing an estate. And older artists actually who are approaching mortality raise questions of a separate but related kind. I think in one case, one of the things that people thought when we were hired to sort of execute the Panza project, that some people thought that we were there to defend bad fabrications of works by Donald Judd, for example. And this became an actually kind of interesting thing for us to encounter, and it told us a lot about the responsibility and the delicacy of the situation. And all I can really say without going on and on at this point, because we just don't have the time, is that we took that very seriously, and it was a kind of surprising, it was not completely unexpected, it became a really interesting and important part of what we thought we were doing. Because in some respects, the relationship between the museum and the estates in question was compromised over the years because of Panza as a figure. And it was our sort of objective to, in part, build some bridges back without at the same time asking permission of estates with respect to judgment calls and difficult questions about the future of the work. To collaborate, yes, but also to respect the differences at the same time. So for us, the project became not just an exercise in problem solving on a practical level, but a kind of, it took us several months to realize that we had been kind of brought into what turned out to be a sort of minefield historically and conceptually, and that became its own sort of topic of the hour in a way. How to map that minefield, not necessarily solve all the problems, but understand the situation better than maybe we had in the past.
And I would just add that I think the funding that came from the Mellon, and particularly the fact that that funding was then renewed. So we started with a 3-year project. It was then renewed and extended for an additional 3 years. And it really gave us the time, I think, to not have those two vantages feel as though they were colliding. We had the space and time, I think, to really bracket the practical considerations and the practical imperatives for a period of time where we undertook the broader study and felt that we were kind of deeply immersed enough in understanding the very kind of specific DNA or fingerprint of each artist's methodology, material choices, whether or not they were using fabricators, and really embody that or occupy that kind of space to then bring that to bear on the practical considerations. And I really do, of course, we're so indebted to the Mellon Foundation and to the Guggenheim to have, conceived of the project and organized it in such a way that we were very protected in our work. We really were able to sort of occupy this project and this project alone for the duration of the study, and it permitted us to set aside the practical concerns.
I can agree more, and for potential funders in the audience and out there in the world who are listening, the space that this creates, a safe space, and the resources, it's absolutely incredible. It changes everything, and it allows you to do what Francesca is describing. And there's no such thing as pure neutrality, and I wouldn't claim it for us or anyone else. And Mellon is Mellon. It's as close as you can get, I think, and museums are settings that aspire to be somewhat neutral in the context of complex decision making. In any case, while there is no such thing in the pure state, it felt closer than normal to us, and it was gratifying.
I'm Lisa Panza. And I also had a question for the two of you. I've been working with Richard Nonas for a number of years, and Richard, by his own admission, is an art historian's worst nightmare. And one of the reasons has to do with something that you touched on a bit, which had to do with the issue of creating a work, disassembling it, using those component parts for a new work, which then gets disassembled and used again later, and sometimes they get dispersed, sometimes they don't. And I just wondered how you've dealt with that in your encounters. I mean, beyond the kind of registrarial sort of issue of assigning numbers and dates, et cetera, but kind of more generally, how you approach that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I don't. Well, in the case of Flavin, it's a sort of common problem in the sense of these, component parts that can sometimes be reused even by collectors or museums. It can be recycled from one piece to another. I don't want to make a big deal out of that, and it's probably not good practice, but it happens because lamps are lamps, so to speak. On the other hand, lamps, the history of fluorescent, the fluorescent light industry changes over time, and so as it turns out, lamps aren't lamps, and you have a whole other set of problems if you think they're all interchangeable. So there's that. On the one hand, that's more of a question maybe for you. But in the case that I mentioned of Robert Morris, really it's not at stake anymore, so it's probably not as relevant to Richard Nonas as I might have implied. It's not an issue we really had to. I just found it historically extremely interesting that in the context of his studio, a lot of the works that we are familiar to us as historians from the early 60s actually existed only for a short period of time, and some of them were composed of parts from other works. I found that to be a big surprise, and it made me think about the history of the work differently and the history of the practice. There's a kind of ghost history of minimal art sort of floating around in here that has to do with fabrication and materials that I think is worth kind of worth pursuing, and that's something we were trying to do for in our way so far.
And I'll just add that one of the things that we kind of came up against when we were encountering some of the practical questions about actually diagramming objects and attempting to kind of assign generations or hierarchies amongst multiple iterations of a given work is we really were bumping up against the limitations of TMS. The database systems that all of us use in the museum world or managing collections. Art after 1960 doesn't necessarily adhere to the standardized terms that many of the collection management protocols and tools accommodate. And it's one of the things that we were banging our heads against the wall for a period of time to really address, the works that were candidates for decommissioning. And we ended up realizing we needed to invent a new category because nothing at the museum accommodated all of the questions that the works contained and enabled us to create a kind of powerful enough corral to protect the works from potential misinterpretation or display without someone fully understanding the deep concerns that we wanted to make sure were very explicit for any future curator considering works in the collection.
I was wondering if your research reflects our time and knowledge at the moment, or if there had been like similar or same knowledge when the work was acquired by the Guggenheim Museum in the 90s, because I remember Germano Celant, he like single-handedly promoted this deal, and there were already a lot of questions around. And how did the museum respond at that time?
Well, it took a long time for I think the museum basically, as we understand it, to make a long story short, many of the problems that we described to you were known at the time or were intimated, I would say. They weren't really...
Not to the degree that we
not even
understand
close,
them now.
not
Yeah.
close. But there was a sense that some of these things were going to kind of become difficult later, unanswered questions. And I think rightly, the decision on the ground was that notwithstanding these problems, the deal itself was ultimately going to be historically far more important for the museum than quibbling over all of these problems and possibly ruining the sale.
And it's useful to just point out that the Panza acquisition overall is over 300 artworks. And for instance, the first, consideration that we made in the Decommissioning Act is only 22 or 23 works.
Yeah. So that's not to say that there weren't a lot of other problems that exceed that category, and that that have been difficult things to face, and which we've tried very hard to do. But I guess I would say that that's the answer to the question. It felt, I think, again, rightly, like too good an opportunity finally to walk away from, based on the emergence of a number of questions and problems. And it was also thought at the time, I think, too, by the people who were there, that they might be able to get around these questions once the acquisition was made by going back to the artists themselves, who were still alive in every case, and who would be asked by the museum to work with the museum on behalf of the work in the collection and make it okay. Which would have meant, for example, asking Judd to authorize refabrications, which in his lifetime he certainly could have done. In the Judd case, the conversation started, but was interrupted by Judd's death, and that became the end of that.
And many things were resolved with the Guggenheim working directly with Dan Flavin. So there were many things that, in fact, were kind of rectified by close dialogue with him while he was still alive. Of course, he died just a couple of years later.
Yeah.
Just one comment to this. It's Eleonora Nagy, conservator. I was the predecessor of Francesca, taking care of the Panza collection for 10 years before they stepped in. I also know the registrar who went out to Varese and put together the basic inspection package on this. And I know from her that the experience was basically unlimited amount of things they didn't really understand what it was, and there was an understanding that this is a whole big package of information which has to be sorted out. Conservators, as far as I know, didn't see any of it, or not the entity what Francesca and Jeff could see for very many years. Even during the 10 years I was there and I was taking care of the collection, I never had access to any of that information which they were lucky enough to process. So there was a big gap of understanding and information. I did have an incident with Naumann, whose piece really needed treatment, and I couldn't directly access the Panzas, but I did manage to talk to him and his assistant, who helped out a lot. And yes, what happened is there were all kinds of misunderstandings between them, which Naumann was kind enough to help, and we could sort it out. The other thing I think we should really think about, and I am not sure it came up here very clearly, that although in many aspects this Panza incident is unfortunate and there are very many negative aspects of it, specifically about Judd, I am convinced that if he wouldn't have been furious about this whole thing, he wouldn't have really thought of what is really his work, what he identifies with. And in retrospect, it gives me a much better understanding and kind of a guideline in a negative way, what is Judd and what is not Judd. And this is an extremely difficult situation because Judd was typically the person who, after a couple of years, did not use his hands at all. So there are a lot of interactions between the fabricators and Judd, but how personal he feels about it and how specific for him every single piece he made is really written in this discussion and in this furious back and forth between Panza and him. So in a negating way, he basically is forced to declare his legacy and is forced to identify what is my work and what is not. So in every negative, there is some good of learning. Basically, that's what happened.
Absolutely. That's the other answer, in a way, to Christian's question, which is that the Guggenheim invented this project partly in order to finally get around to really kind of addressing these questions, to bringing a lot of work that had never been shipped from Milan since the acquisition over to New York for us to inspect, and to subject it to this kind of formal study, which was a collaboration and which involved a lot of other people, I should add, including a very distinguished advisory committee composed of colleagues from other museums and universities, some of whom are in this room. So we were given, in a way, access, and as well as time, access to information and time to digest it that had never really been made available before. And the other thing that you said, I think, is also important. The impact on Judd himself of the dispute between Judd and Panza was very important and became part of the history of the work and something for us to unpack, which we feel we were able to do pretty thoroughly.
And it was not only Judd who was kind of the instance of Judd publicly publishing the essay, of course, now becomes this valuable document for us to refer to understand exactly what his position is. But it's not exclusively something that benefited Judd. It's sort of across the board. We have correspondence from most of the artists in the collection who similarly were kind of prompted to state their case to Panza when Panza took liberties or was making choices on behalf of the work's fabrication or installation that wasn't in accordance to how the artists wanted the works to be shown. And we have nearly 30 years of correspondence between Robert Irwin and Panza that is just this fabulous record of Irwin over and over again, really describing the terms of the work. And it's almost a sort of exploration of the artists themselves, struggling to really articulate and respond to some of the choices that Panza was making. So he's a very useful historic figure.
Just add a quick question about you hinted that you were not the only ones making the decisions. I'm curious about the decommissioning process, how consensual it was or how non-consensual it was in some cases.
It was our ambition to create a consensus, which is what we thought we were there to do, but also to open up our determinations and subject them to the criticism of others. And it became an extremely, one of the most interesting conversations I've ever had in my professional life in that context, because it was a way of kind of asking an institution to be as self-critical and self-reflective as possible, which, as we all know, institutions aren't used to doing. Or being. So in that sense, it was super, it was an extremely interesting thing for us, and it was, the determinations in the end were consensual for the most part. Not every single question has been answered, but it was a process that was conducted by us with other staff members as well as with the Board of Trustees. So it was as inclusive as possible, and we thought that would give it, whatever happened, would have a kind of legitimacy that needed to be represented by the institution as a whole.
I have a question for Rochelle. I don't want to cut in line, but just quickly, what do either Bob or Jack talk about after Jack?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, to be honest, both Bob and Jack are very critical and almost a little scornful of traditional conservation training. Not in general, but in regard to the aptitude of training people to treat these new materials and process. So, but you know, it's interesting, this discussion about Judd, of course, in and of itself, but also with Bob, he's also very dismissive of conservation sometimes. Like, it's not my problem, someone will do it, someone will do it bad, good. It's, you know, he's told me once if I was thinking of that, I'd be gardening the gardens at the Getty every day. But it's not completely true, of course. He's also really so peculiar about the way his work is presented. So I think they're basically in denial. And Jack thinks he's immortal.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Getting back to what Nora had said about not having the works accessible, I'm not the registrar that she was referring to, but I was the head registrar at the Guggenheim in the late 90s. And I know that all those works were in storage, in crates. And one day we decided we were going to open the Larry Bell crates, two planes. I think they're about 9 by 9 feet each, one mirrored side, slightly brown. And we opened the one crate, and there it was. It's gorgeous. We opened the second crate. It was a pile of shards at the bottom. So we contacted Larry Bell and said, what do we do? He said, refabricate. Well, that had to be done in Germany because that's where they were done at the original plant. We went out there, surveyed, made sure that everything was good, brought them back. Larry looked at them and said, it's not the same. So we said, well, what do we do? He said, well, this is the work. He said, this new, different work was the same work. I could never really wrap my head around that, but it wasn't my decision to make, it was his. So what happened was it was also an additioned work. And the other edition of the work was in Denver, and we called Denver and said, would you like a spare part? And they said, sure, we'll pay for shipping. But how do you feel about the fact that this was an additioned work, which then became a different work, which is the same work? How do
I
you
love it.
It's
I mean,
uncomfortable.
okay.
really
No, this is weird.
uncomfortable.
No, it's not uncomfortable. No, it's I mean, I'm not kidding in the sense that, you know, it just keeps me up at night in the best possible way, right? Because it's got everything to do with, it's a bunch of, it's just a conundrum. And I guess, you know, again, the short answer is that, you know, for me, is that it's, at a certain point, we decided that we actually couldn't solve that problem because the problem is like it's 20 problems. And it's a problematic, really, in the most complex kind of philosophical sense, because a lot of these artists share certain terms, and then they break down into other kind of separate categories, which means that the status of replication, copy, example, iteration, version, all of these words mean similar and related, but often different things. The status of an object in that context just shifts around all the time, and is completely unstable in that sense, which is something that became, I will say, as an historian, it totally changed my life because I wasn't thinking that way about the work that I was doing, and suddenly I had to face something that had been conveniently left out of the story. Having said that, it's extremely hard to square that problem, which is so interesting, with the needs and imperatives of an institution. And I don't think there is no single solution to that. We certainly don't claim to have invented one. But it's one useful thing we can do is identify the problem in a deeper way. And
make him put it in writing.
you made him, yeah. I mean, it's true. A work. This is one of the things I was alluding to earlier. Over the course of decades, an artist is permitted, except legally there are questions, and Virginia's here, so maybe we'll hear from her. An artist more or less is allowed by us to do whatever they want to do. And then other entities step in and create rules and standards and laws. And of course, that's all necessary and important because there's a market at stake. But it's that unstable situation that I think historically is something we should never lose sight of. That the problems can be solved in specific and local ways, but the larger situation that it represents is a very, very important part of the history of art from that period, in a way that I think distinguishes it from other periods of Western art.
And I'll just add quickly two things, and I know Rachel wants to add to this as well, that, I say uncomfortable responding to what happened, because I think also as a conservator coming onto this project, I had this painful learning curve, because we're, of course, so rooted and just, it's so reflexive to be attempting to respond to the original object. And it's been, the case where and it's not for every artist that we looked at, but in several cases there really is no such thing. And you have to radically reshift the way that you're examining your own choices around extant objects and around objects that are meant to be fabricated and refabricated, because it's a whole other set of concerns. So that's my uncomfortable kind of phantom limb conservation response that I've learned to, adapt to a little bit. And then just quickly, secondly, one of the things the Panza collection suffered from, and I think other artworks from the 60s and 70s and obviously more contemporary works potentially suffer from too, is this assumption of refabricability. So they're not cared for as well. They're not created as well. They're not, they're literally put in jeopardy more, because there's this underlying assumption that we can just remake it. And it's absolutely not the case across the board, and nor is it appropriate across the board. There's exceptions and instances where it indeed is entirely appropriate, but many of the works in the Panza collection suffered from that set of assumptions prior to its coming to the Guggenheim.
In the case of Bob Morris, he went from anything's remakeable, basically, in his career, in the course of his career, to a position now which is almost the opposite of that. And I'll just sort of throw that out there as there's one artist with respect to the same set of objects making a completely different set of determinations over time.
And to just throw further confusion into that discussion about Larry Bell, it's just really interesting, and we don't even know if the term authenticity has any relevance here, but Larry routinely, when he made his pieces, his cubes, for example, he made extra, and whenever something broke, he has been providing people with replacements. Sometimes the replacements were not from the same set of fabrications. It was something that looked similar to him and was admissible, but again, like once he's not there, who decides what's permissible? And once there's no more replacement panels, then the game is changing. And then a little bit similar to your situation, there was this very large piece called The Iceberg and Its Shadows that was acquired by MIT, and half of the panels broke, and they asked Larry to remake it, and he actually refused. He said, I could not possibly remake it. First of all, I'm too old for that. But also the mistakes I'd made at the time trying to make this giant beast were part of it, and I could not reproduce these coincidental sets of conditions. So he suggested to have the German fabricator remake it, but call it something different. But then it never happened because of funding. So.
I'm Nina Quabeck. I'm part of the Nacker network and conservator at the Kunstsammlung in Düsseldorf. And this is to thank you all for this brilliant panel this afternoon. And I'm researching in my PhD thesis the artist's intent in contemporary art.
Good luck.
Have fun with it.
Thank you, I need it.
Better you than me.
Right. I'm not sure. Well, I thought it's basically also for all three of you. First, I'm really grateful you shared the story of your repeated interviews with Bob Morris, because I think it's very clear from what you said that it's an ongoing conversation, and it's totally clear that over a long career there's a lot of changes, and changes of mind and of memory, and I think from it quite aligns with my research that you really have to be thinking of intent as something that's accumulative, where you don't really want to say, oh, it's been written in stone, this one statement, and we go back to that, but we collect all this information and discuss it. And it's, Rachel, the same with you, and talking to Bob and saying it's so important that Jack is a part of this process. So I think intent can be understood as opened up as well to include other people, like the fabricators, quite importantly. This is more of a comment. But
We, in the Panza initiative, when we did these monographic case studies, for instance, with Judd, in the case where there wasn't a living artist, instead we attempted to exhaustively interview, other people that had been associated with the art making practice, through the years, whoever we could talk to just try to paint the broadest possible picture. The same with Flavin, but obviously when we were dealing with a living artist, we relied less so on that, but we also attempted to, capture as much as we could from these secondary or tertiary voices.
Hi, I'm Luisa Sarrias. I'm a conservator. I wanted to ask you, you say that Dan Flavin was living so he was alive when you were taking the collection from Panza?
When the Panza collection happened at the Guggenheim, he was still alive for a few years.
We
weren't there. Yeah,
Oh,
we
you
weren't
weren't
there.
there. Okay, good. No, because I was wondering why you did not, or what he was thinking, why was his work not reproduced or remade when now the state, who is a gallery, is finishing a series from Dan Flavin that are not finished.
Yeah, but he did at that time agree. In fact, he asked for refabrications of a number of works in the collection.
And you did not, and you did decide not to do
No,
it.
no, the museum moved ahead in
that's
collaboration
great.
with the artist.
Oh, I
But there were a
understood
few
that one-
examples.
Oh,
There were
yeah.
a few examples of works that just were not finalized enough, and it was the case where the museum just literally ran out of time to work with him to kind of resolve. And in the case of the work that we showed, it was something that Flavin had proposed for Varese, and there was, a degree of question of whether or not, it was something that he'd cite in any other location.
No, it was just
Which work?
no, that with the corners and the
Circular piece.
yeah, the circular piece, which is very beautiful and because the state, who is the gallery, is refinishing now series that were not finished alive.
Right, but as Francesca was saying, there's no longer enough information
Right,
and
right.
you're saying it's a shame that it didn't happen in his lifetime.
Right.
And we agree.
Right.
Okay, so maybe you can continue the discussion over your coffee and be back at 5 o'clock, please.